All right. A ton of you have been messaging me about this Alabama ruling and asking me what I think about it. Um, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that frozen unimplanted embryos qualify as human children. Obviously, this has many implications for things like in vitro fertilization. IVF is probably one of the most controversial topics that I discuss and have been discussing since either 2019 or 2020. So, obviously, there have been a lot of thinkers and commentators who have been discussing this for a lot longer than I have, for decades and decades, really, since the inception of IVF. You've had a lot of Christian and Catholic thinkers discussing some of the ethical issues with IVF. However, it hasn't really been a central conversation in evangelicalism. And I think a lot of it has to do with just kind of our lack of cohesive theology of the body. I think we've kind of got down what we think about sex versus sex outside of marriage, gender, sometimes gender roles. There's disagreement on that. Um, Sex, sexuality, things like that. But when it comes to IVF, when it comes to surrogacy, when it comes to reproductive technology, I found that many evangelicals, and yes, many Catholics too, but since I'm surrounded by so many evangelicals, I just see a lot of thoughtlessness when it comes to these subjects. And it's kind of just the mentality of, well, I'm pro life and so I'm pro baby. And I think any method or means that we employ to create life is good. And really, there hasn't been a whole lot of consideration of how the life is created, if it's moral, if it's ethical, to use in vitro fertilization and then to put embryos on ice. And there's really a disconnect because we as pro lifers say life is life at conception, made in the image of God, made with purpose and with dignity. And just like any other human, that tiny human at the earliest stages of development is entitled to human rights, the foremost being the right to life, the right to not be murdered, mistreated, abused. And we don't then have that same mentality, though, when it comes to embryos, when it comes to these unimplanted human beings that are still made in the image of God, and yet through IVF are very often left in a freezer, sometimes indefinitely. Very often they are discarded because the parents have decided they've had all the kids that they want, or sometimes there's a divorce. And so the parents don't want the embryos that they have extracted and created and frozen, or sometimes, actually, very often, I would say in the vast majority of the cases of IVF, there is a eugenics process that goes into it. The scientists, the doctors can test these embryos to see if they have any kind of genetic disorder or some kind of special need. Of course, they can test whether the embryo is a boy or a girl, and then parents can make the decision based on those findings which embryos they want to kill, discard, which embryos they want to implant, or which embryos they want to surrender, which embryos they want to pay to stay in a freezer for years and years. And my basic take is that that's no way to treat a child. Like, that's no way to treat a human being. If we believe as Christian pro lifers that these humans are made in the image of God, and therefore they have dignity, they have innate worth, and therefore they are entitled to human rights, then we shouldn't be treating these little human beings like this. Just because an adult wants to be a parent, just because they may have gone through a very difficult fertility and pregnancy process, which we can have a lot of compassion for, these things don't justify treating human beings like this. And I understand there are different methods, well, not really different methods of IVF, but there are different scenarios. There are some scenarios in which the parents implant all the embryos that have been created. And of course, I think that is a much, much better and more ethical option than creating a ton of embryos, which is what most people do. Like Paris Hilton, I think she said, like, has 20 embryos on ice. She's obviously not going to implant all of those embryos. So I think it's much better to only create as many embryos as you are willing to implant and have. But the implantation process is very risky for the embryo as well. I mean, there are many cases when, unfortunately, the embryo thaws before it has been implanted, and so the embryo dies. And so, even in those cases, we are asking these little human beings to take a big risk in that implantation and freezing and implantation process to satisfy our own wants as adults. And I think that is simply disordered. And I do think it's unethical. That doesn't mean that your children created through IVF don't have value and dignity. Of course they do. They're made in the image of God. And I know you love them so much and they're precious children, of course. But that does not mean the IVF process is something that we should advocate for or support as Christians. So that's basically where I stand, just to give a summary of my stance on IVF. And so, as you can probably imagine, I support the reasoning in this Alabama Supreme Court ruling that said these unimplanted embryos qualify as human children, and so they have rights like human children.